And Dre didn't have the script up, but welcome back to another Boxscore Geek show. I'm your host, Dre Alvarez. We are in the midst of the off season, but the good news, Brian, is there is stuff for us to discuss, even if it isn't necessarily pertinent, which is the key. As mentioned, I'm your host, Dre Alvarez, aka Nerd Numbers. With me, as always, is my sorry, Brian, stumbled out the gate. Let's try again. Producer, voice of God, man of many hats, Brian Foster. On Twitter as Boxscore Brian. Say hey, Brian.
What's going on, Dre? And yeah, I guess you're right. Impertinence, that's our specialty. So we'll get into some of that tonight, maybe.
Well, and for the record, obviously we're in the off season. I was out of town last week. Stuff comes up and that's not a big deal. But the good news is there's at least a sprinkling of NBA news and then some other topics that I may find excuses to talk about. And as mentioned to you, Brian, there is a potential window to get things stupid and off the rails. So we'll see if that comes up. Let's give a major shout out to our boy, Greg Steele, who we recently had on the show. I have no complaints with this, Brian, honestly, but I think he's going to lap us very quickly. He is producing content like a monster, amazing stuff. So GreekGodOfStats.com. As mentioned, it's one of the first metrics where I can both simultaneously disagree while approve, which is a weird. I actually want to get off on this slight tangent again, Brian. I know it's come up before, but I figure we'll hammer it home a few more times as the year goes on, especially if we examine things like the new metrics that I believe 538 is going to be releasing for basketball if they haven't already released them. I can have disagreements with how metrics in the NBA are constructed or with complaints about certain metrics. A common one we bring up in the wins produced formula all the time, and actually Greg Steele is one of the first people who has addressed this the way I would like, is position. If we get in an argument about whether or not Dirk Nowitzki is really a power forward versus not, that is a fair argument. The problem is most of the metrics people come up with, things like BPM, even the RPM stuff, whatever, the way they address that problem is not done so in an efficient way. So while I might have a philosophical disagreement to start with the metric, we can't even go on to step two because the methods that they use to try and deal with that philosophical difference is done incorrectly. So many of the metrics in basketball do not handle the fact that there are just multiple positions in basketball, and it has to be this way because there are rules that prevent how many people can go close to the hoop at a time, right? There's the lane in basketball, so you really can only have two players close to the hoop at a time. There is a limit on the supply of tall people that can play basketball, which is way different than other sports because in the NBA, there are only so many tall, coordinated people who can do this. And if they can do this, they've probably already been scouted and discovered and added into the NBA. And there are not enough to even handle, say, a 10-team league, let alone a 30-team league. So there are already restrictions in those two parts that make basketball a very position-full sport.
And just the size of the court, right? You can only, fit so many people. It's just like Ari Caroline floor stretch principles, right?
Yeah, I mean, the basketball, because one of the key parts about basketball is one, there's no augmentation. So as an example, in football, baseball, and hockey, the three other major U.S. sports, right, there is added equipment that lets normal humans get even stronger, right? In football, it's funny, right? Helmets are a weapon, which is kind of weird, right? It was the opposite intent. They're allowed to wear pads, et cetera. And it's completely vertical. There's no real or horizontal, right? It's horizontal. There's not really a lot of verticality outside of field goals. And obviously the right way to play football is really to run and pass. So there's that. In baseball and hockey, you are given a stick. And then in hockey, you're given magic shoes that mean that if you're not very fast, but you can glide, you're still effective.
Well, horse racing, you get a horse.
I don't consider it up there, but I mean, that's an example. Like as soon as you start getting into as soon as you get to like the pinnacle of this, which would be like NASCAR racing, you're like,
yeah, there you go.
None of you look like athletes. And we've now, and I wouldn't say they're not athletes. I disagree with that. It's like you've now been reduced to like hand-eye coordination as the skill that we're worried about. Whereas basketball is one of the fewer. It's like, you've got to be able to sprint. You've got to have endurance by length of the game, right? Basketball is not like baseball where there are these breaks, or even football where these long breaks. So it's like you've got to be able to sprint. You've got to have endurance. You've got to be able to jump. You've got to have muscles, right? Because you're allowed to muscle each other around. It's a weird sport in that regard. So all of these come together to make basketball a weird place. And so back to the original point, though, saying that there might be philosophical disagreements. There are statistical methods you have to follow or use if we want to discuss how to analyze a stat. And if you don't do it right, we have to throw it out. I bring up the Cracked podcast at least 10 times a show, Brian, but one of my favorites over there, one of the favorite guests, Jason Pargin, has brought this up before about, of all things, documentaries. And I've actually heard this in two ways, because I believe I don't know if I don't know if it was a podcast or a documentary. It was actually about someone in Wisconsin. It's called like Making a Murder or something. I don't know if you're familiar with this one, but
I've heard of it, but haven't seen it or heard it. Very popular, I know. Sorry for being a square, Dre.
Yeah, I'm in the same. Well, it's interesting. There is a guy that has. Sorry to already get so deep, but there is a guy that has been a guest on Dan Harmon's podcast that has his own show where he analyzes a lot of this true crime stuff. And he said something interesting, which is he goes, a lot of times the problems we run into in finding problems with police discrepancies, and rest assured there are lots of problems with how the police do things in this country, is that the person is guilty, but the police get them the wrong way. And so then it is very easy to make a narrative. And that's it. That is his argument. I don't know for sure. I believe it's called Making a Murderer. But he is basically...
It's technically a true crime documentary television series.
Okay, thank you. His argument of that is the guy is guilty, but the police did not get him the correct way, and thus their story falls apart. And Jason Pargin has said this a lot, where there are documentaries that are, it's foolish to believe any documentary, man, I got that word wrong, documentary isn't partisan or biased in some regard. I hate this idea of unbiased stuff. If you want unbiased stuff, you just look at numbers and everybody agrees numbers are boring on their own. But the sheer fact that you've chosen to make a documentary means that you've got a subject in mind and there's some bias. Lots of documentaries want to help their bias, and as a result, play the story such that it does it. And the problem is it falls apart, because then when people that are against your point find the holes in your documentary, it actually hurts your case as opposed to help it. Because the two examples he gave, Morgan Spurlock did the Super Size Me, the movie where he eats lots of McDonald's.
Yep.
And the results that he presents in that movie are not replicatable. His argument was he ate McDonald's every day for like a month or a couple months. Every time they asked him to supersize, he supersized. And he has this doctor that's like, oh my God, your body is falling apart. You're dying. You've got to stop doing this to yourself. And of course, Morgan Spurlock's attack is McDonald's food is bad for you. I want to make a documentary showing how McDonald's food is bad for you. The reality is McDonald's food is bad for you. And it's very boring if you go, there's too much sodium, too many calories, et cetera, that over years and years and years, this is going to hurt you, probably leave you with hypertension, probably leave you with diabetes, probably scrape years and years off your life. And it's going to take years to happen. But what Morgan Spurlock trying to say, if you eat McDonald's every day, it's going to immediately destroy you. Lots of people can watch it and go, I have McDonald's every day. I'm overweight, but I'm not dying, right? I'm fine.
Yeah, it's pretty bogus, right? I haven't seen it, but I heard it was a pretty bogus documentary.
Exactly, and that hurts the case. There's another one on fracking where these people are trying to show that their water is lightable on fire, and they were lying about it. And of course, you want to say fracking, potentially contaminates local drinking water, possibly helps is a weird way of phrasing it, but possibly leads to increased seismic activity, earthquakes in areas that didn't used to have it. And all of that might be true. But when you try and then go one step further and say it's so bad it's leaking gas into your water and your water's flammable and that's false, now you get people that are pro-fracking going, that's a lie. And so I'm actually in the same boat with analytics where I go, even if your argument is certain metrics like the wins produced formula don't favor things like volume shooting or spacing the floor, et cetera, well enough. If you come up with these metrics, which so many have done, that basically, I've said this before, like RPM, BPM, fail regression 101. Any teacher would throw them out first class. Things like plus minus, they just fail things like statistical significance. You just can't, any statistician would go, we cannot conclusively say within, standard error bars that this is statistically significant. As soon as you start using those, we can't even have the debate because I have to throw it. I go, your metric is garbage. We can't use it. Whereas Greg Steele, the method he used, basically coming up with a new way of deciding players' position on offense and defense, comparing them to league average and using box score statistics with a systemized method of assigning credit for those box score statistics is exactly what I want. And then we can get into arguments about, I think you give too much credit for assists because of blah, or, I think this player isn't really that position because of blah, or the argument we've said, Brian, which is, and the same argument we've heard about ours is like maybe basketball is more positionless or these positions don't matter, et cetera. We can get there. So sorry for that long preamble saying why, kind of saying why I've agreed more with Greg's stuff and why we're going to talk about him. And that's what I said. One of the funny things about his work is he'll look at the new Stats VU data. These are these tracking cameras in the NBA that track every couple of milliseconds per thing and give stuff like time of possession, touches, who's guarding who, how many contested shots, etc. And his argument to Russell Westbrook is actually that Russell Westbrook is a really good passer, and that on the Oklahoma City Thunder, his team is basically squandering opportunities. Whereas if he goes to the Houston Rockets, he might be better. So that's Greg Steele. You can check it off on offtheglassbasketball.com. He's got a couple. And like I said, the first article, this is just more of a shout out. And then, like I said, explaining why we agree with his methods or approve the methodology, even if we don't necessarily agree 100% with the philosophy. Him saying Russell Westbrook is an upgrade, at least on offense, to Chris Paul because he's an amazing passer. And we would expect next to James Harden and Clint Capella, he is going to be better than he is next to Steve Adams. And it's hard to say. Paul George is pretty good, but I'd still call those two an upgrade.
Yeah, no, this was an interesting article. So the one thing about the Morey angle, which is one you went for, right, is that Chris Paul finished second, right, on this list. So Morey has upgraded from the second best passing player to the first best. That's something. Do you want to talk more about what he did to calculate this? Did you say that specifically just then? Or?
I think I'd have to go in, and I don't have it up in front of me, and I don't want to get more than just shut up. But I'm saying this is like I'm looking at you, analytics community, and giving Greg a thumbs up, and the rest of you are like, what the fuck? And the NBA released Sports VU data in 2015, 2016 league-wide. Stats.nba.com, there's tracking data. I have looked at some stuff for fun. There's stuff that, like I said, I've got a tangent I'll get off on a second, but there's stuff I've looked at for fun and stuff I'd want to do with it. But that's where you should have gone. We're on iteration number 20 of plus minus, right? People are using BPM and you see PIPM. And what these are, this is just wrong. You can't do a regression on a regression. That makes no fucking sense. And that's what things like BPM and PIPM are, which is you're taking the box score statistics, regressing them onto a on-off plus-minus statistic that is regressed onto point margin to try and calculate player value, which is, even if you want to factor in on-off statistics with box score statistics in a regression, that's not how you do it. And one of these days we'll explain more in depth, Ryan. I'll try and break it down more systematically. One of the fundamental, just out there for people that are curious, that are like, what, I hear all this regression. The way a regression should work, the key phrase you should have in your mind is all else being equal. So the idea being, Brian making a 2-point shot, we can't actually analyze how good of a player Brian is without going all else being equal. So if Brian Foster is guaranteed to make you 10 2-pointers a game, Brian, I'm going to call you amazing. You make 10 2-pointers a game. If we don't... How
many shots am I taking, though?
Exactly. Okay, first off, we have to assess how much is Brian shooting and what else is Brian doing on the court. If you make 10 2-pointers a game on 60% efficiency, Brian, sounds pretty good, right? So I'd be like, whatever. I just messed up math entirely. I'm not even going to try. If you made 10 2-pointers a game, so 20 points a game, shooting 60% efficiency on those shots, but you did 15 turnovers, you're a net negative to your team. So first off, if we get that stat, we have to look at first what else Brian is doing and how much that matters. And then we also have to ask ourselves, this is another key point, this isn't necessarily in regression, but in like NBA, because it's zero sum, how is the rest of the league doing? Because if Brian gets you 10 2-pointers a game, but every player in the NBA gets you 10 2-pointers a game at the same efficiency, Brian's not actually efficient. He's below league average. And by the way, this is one of the things we brought up on why it gets really hard to evaluate players over time like Donovan Mitchell is there has been inflation in the NBA. This is beautiful, Brian. I'm actually going to keep this on the Houston Rockets and get us into James Harden. Because there's been inflation in the NBA so that players are better than they were in the past, which means that if you're putting up numbers like Shaquille O'Neal was doing in the 90s, that's not as valuable. That was one of the most surprising things as an example to me, Brian. Joel Embiid, from a raw production standpoint, looks very similar, not quite as good, but very similar to Shaquille O'Neal in the 90s. Here's the problem. Shaquille O'Neal's numbers in the 90s are not as good in the modern NBA. He has to be more efficient. He has to get more rebounds, right? For all this weird death of the big man, there are so many great bigs in the NBA. Clint Capella and Rudy Gobert as examples, we just have to throw out there. And then some also weird Ben Simmons and Giannis, where you have these essentially centers that are playing point guard now. that the modern NBA requires you to be much better than you were in the past. And that brings us up to kind of a weird point, not necessarily related to Greg's articles. We'll get to his next one last. But I wanted to get into our second topic, Brian, sorry to jump us ahead, which is Daryl Morey making a controversial statement. And it's funny. Do you remember these old standardized tests in school, Brian?
God, yeah, I did take so many of those.
Do you remember the term tepid?
Sure.
And the reason I bring this up is if you had to take old standardized tests, the example question I dealt with, I don't know if it was before, after.
This question is making me feel a little bit tepid, but continue.
Yeah, so the example was they would say the tepid water, blah, blah, blah. And they would say, what's the definition of tepid? And this was an example question I had in standardized tests for years. And so now when I see a take like Daryl Morey's, the word that comes to mind because of that, because all of those years of getting brainwashed by standardized tests, it's a very tepid take. His take was, it is just factually accurate that James Harden is a better scorer than Michael Jordan. And this lets me get back to a tangent and an article in progress I have, Brian, one of our favorites, the time machine arguments of basketball, and the, I would say, 3 different methods. I'm going to give an appendix 4 methods of player comparison. So
Morey basically said, right, the time machine doesn't exist. So that's why I think what I think, right? He took a cop out is what you're saying.
But here's what I'm going to say funny. I'm saying Morey aces this test in 3 out of 4 of the methods I'm going to bring up, and we've discussed this. All right, so the first method, and this is for the record wins produced. The first method is you take a player, and in the article I'm coming up with, I compare these all to time travel movies. And so the movie I'm going to compare it to is Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. Those that forget Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, these 2 kids have to pass a history class. To do so, they give an amazing presentation. And what they do is they go through time. They pick up amazing historical figures. I believe Abraham Lincoln, Freud, Genghis Khan, Joan of Arc, Billy the Kid, and I think one other.
Socrates, also known as Socrates, but they call him Socrates.
That's good memory. They bring them all to the future, and they get an A because they say all the great things these people have done. The key there being is any one of those figures, I hate to be mean, if we advance them to the future, is not as great. The reason we think they're great is because of what they did in their eras. It's a funny one. Have you seen the movie Shazam, Brian?
No, I haven't.
It was good. I enjoyed it. But in Shazam, it's this stupid long acronym. It's like he's got the strength of the strength of Hercules.
Oh, the word Shazam is an acronym.
The word Shazam is an acronym because in the story, he says the word Shazam and he turns into Captain Marvel, who's the superhero. And Captain Marvel has all of these different attributes, and it's like strength of Hercules. And one of them is the wisdom of Solomon, who's, this famous character in the Bible. And I made a point. I was like, the funny thing is, if you've got a character in the Bible, Solomon's like major thing, if you don't recall, is 2 people are like, this is my baby. He's like, we're going to cut the baby in half. And someone's like, no, don't cut it in half. He's like, ha, it's your baby, because, the person who cares most about the baby would never let us cut it in half. Like, that was considered wisdom. I'm like,
I know.
Because I was watching the movie and I said, he doesn't seem very smart. And then I go, well, you know what? The funny thing is, the wisdom of Solomon is probably worse than a modern teenager with a smartphone in the United States. So,
but back then, maybe that was the wisest guy around,
Well, that's what I'm saying. So for this comparison, for the reason I bring up Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure is because all of the time travel is to look at people in their era, because that's when they're great. And so when I take a player like Michael Jordan and compare them to James Harden, the simplest method to do is to say, how did Michael Jordan look against his contemporaries? How does James Harden look against his contemporaries, and who is better? And I was expecting, Brian, Michael Jordan to have an out here to say Michael Jordan's scoring efficiency was so good in his era, because the NBA, you can do this. I just Google this, Brian, but I'll try and get you the URL, but you can do Basketball Reference league averages. And Basketball Reference has league average by year. And I believe, let's see, if you do per 100, I'm trying to see if they do like effective field goal percentage. But if you go, so you can go, it's basketballreference.com/leagues/NBA_stats_per_pos.html. You're welcome. Okay. So if you look at modern NBA, effective field goal percentage, 52.4%. Scroll all the way back to the mid 80s, 1985. Like, that's Michael Jordan's heyday. I'd say his best year is probably 1988, 48.8% true effective field goal percentage. The league as a whole got 4% better at shooting, just from not excluding the free throw line, got 4% better in terms of shooting. A lot of this is shooting more threes, by the way, than they were in Michael Jordan's era. So if I say, how was Michael Jordan as a scorer compared to his era versus how effective was James Harden as a scorer compared to his era? Does Michael Jordan have a case? And they're both very good, but the survey says, Brian, I looked this up, James Harden was a better scorer by this metric than Michael Jordan.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I've got Brian speechless on that point.
Well, I guess what I want to know is what the margin is. Like, how close was it?
And so here's what I ended up doing. What I did is I've used this method before called net points. What you want to do with net points is you look at the total number of points a player makes, scores, right? You remove their shot attempts and you remove their free throw attempts. That's the simple method you could do. Now, of course, the problem, as I mentioned, if you're comparing to contemporaries, net points, because I've done articles like this before about Kevin Durant, and spoiler alert, he's going to come up in a second. I've done methods like this before, and it's not factoring in era. And so what I did is I took a player's points that they got from the field, so not free throws, and I subtracted out how effective field goal percentage, so that's how well the league shoots from the field, times their attempts. So I say, how many points did you score that weren't free throws? Subtract out how good the league was when you played at how well they shot from the field. This is effective field goal percentage if you're looking on sites like Basketball Reference. That's step one. Step two, I took the number of free throws they made, and I subtracted out the league free throw rate times the number of players' attempts times the league free throw average. So basically I'm saying, how many points did you score on the shots you took? And then how many free throw points did you make relative to what the league should have made on the number of shots you took, if that made any sense? Because it gets a little interesting, because part of the goodness of players like Kobe actually is that they get to the line a lot. So I did that, right? I did that for both James Harden and Michael Jordan. And James Harden's best season, you'll be shocked, was last season. His adjusted net points in that method, that means how many, and I did this per 100 possession was the last part, because they want per possession because, of course, Michael Jordan played more minutes than James Harden. So per 100 possessions, James Harden compared to league average is a +9 just on his shooting. That is remarkable, because as we mentioned, like a great team, that on its own, right, by the way, just on offense, that's the Golden State Warriors that won 73 games almost, just from his scoring. So if he does other stuff good, and James Harden is a very good passer and all that stuff too, we can argue his defense. So +9.1 adjusted net points per 100 possessions. Michael Jordan's best season, which was 1989, +8.1. So James Harden's best season bested Michael Jordan's by almost a full point.
I bet if you dig deeper, there would be sort of a compounding effect on the shot selection. And what I mean by that is when Harden's taking more threes, he's also taking less, long twos. So he's not just, adding shots. He's not just converting shots, from average shots to above average shots. It's like he's converting them from below average to above average. So I don't know if I'm saying that right, but yeah.
That's a great point. And I mean, we've made this point about two players. So Chris Paul and Kevin Durant are two players where if you look at their shot chart, you are like, holy cow, every single shot they take from anywhere on the field is acceptable. And this gets interesting because, as an example, LaMarcus Aldridge and DeMar DeRozan, who are both on the Spurs, are both very good mid-range shooters, in that I'm saying if you look at how well they shoot from mid-range versus how well the NBA shoots from mid-range, they are very good. The problem we run into is you would usually want a decent shooting guard taking a three over either of those players taking a mid-range shot. Exactly what you're saying, right? I a lot of times a way to improve your team is you say, I just get rid of the bad and do something slightly better, and that makes me great. So I love that point that you brought up there. And then that brings up the only time travel test that we've come up with in the past that Daryl Morey doesn't win outright. So that point is, I call it the clone high test. So this was a one-season show, and the logic was there was this high school, and it had a bunch of great figures. It had clones of these great figures, Abraham Lincoln again, of course, and I think Gandhi and a few other people. So basically, you take a great person, you clone them, you put them in modern high school. And so that exact question, if you were to clone Michael Jordan and have Michael Jordan grow up to be the exact same age as James Harden, would Michael Jordan enter the league and take more threes? Because Michael Jordan's very fascinating in that he started taking more threes when the NBA shortened the three-point line. And he looked like he was decent at taking threes right before the Bulls took off. But when the Bulls took off for their first three-peat, Michael Jordan basically just embraced being a driver and was not a good three-point shooter. So the question we get is, would a Michael Jordan that grew up in the modern NBA know to take threes. We brought this up about one of the reasons Steph Curry might be Steph Curry is that he was the son of Del Curry, and Del Curry was an amazing and was the fact that Steph Curry grew up watching Del Curry. Is that what impacted him? And of course, this gets very Primer. There's a time traveling movie called Primer that I'm not going to make any basketball analytics comparisons to. It's too confusing. But it's this very mind melting movie about time travel. Because if Michael Jordan, if you bring a Michael Jordan up, Michael Jordan influenced the way players play now. So a clone of Michael Jordan, does that really count as Michael Jordan versus James Harden? Because that Michael Jordan has to know about Michael Jordan. So you can't really compare Michael Jordan to Michael Jordan with this method because Michael Jordan has to play his entire career, and then we have to have Michael Jordan raised new. So it's not a great one, but that's the question. Could a Michael Jordan raised in the modern NBA be a better scorer than James Harden? And I think there is a very real possibility, yes. But I also find that that's interesting because James Harden is one of the greatest scorers ever.
Yeah, I've never looked at it that way, and that's a really interesting distinction. Yeah, because for every Steph Curry, there's like a Ben Simmons, right? Like Ben Simmons is apparently learning to shoot threes and can shoot them well, and maybe he will shoot them this season. But when he entered the league, it's just like, well, no one can stop me when I drive, so I'm just going to drive every time. And Jordan did that at times too, right? So, yeah, I mean, that's a good point.
Well, and then also this is a topic when we possibly discuss Spider-Man and Kevin Durant. We'll see if that comes up, is that we also don't know what's going to motivate Michael Jordan because we're looking at shooting efficiency. And we've said forever, the things that players do are often to get them paid. And there are two questions you can have. Does this player know that they are doing something bad? Does Allen Iverson know that his mid-range jumper is not helping the team win? Maybe. So there's the first. We'll give him the easy out. Maybe he thinks he's helping his team. But the second is Allen Iverson knows if he scores 20 points a game, he's going to get a max contract. Allen Iverson doesn't know if he improves his shooting efficiency to 55% effective field goal percentage, 57% true shooting for his era, which would be very good. He doesn't know if that's going to get him paid. So we don't know even if a Michael Jordan raised in the modern NBA is going to say, hey, I'm just going to shoot more threes than do these amazing dunks and mid-range shots, because those amazing dunks and when we talk Michael Jordan, as funny as this is, the things that come up often are the rings in a lot of his moments. If he doesn't have those moments, is he as prolific as he is? So, all right.
True.
Last method, and by the way, Daryl Morey obviously wins this one as well, which is to say, I call it the Back to the Future method. And the Back to the Future method, with the exclusion of, we always have to let the underdog win, does seem to follow the premise that the future kicks the past's ass. And so as an example, if we were to take the modern Rockets and transport them back in time to play the Bulls in the mid-90s, right? 1996, right? The 72-win Bulls. Would that be a contest? And of course, we've heard players like Magic Johnson saying the Showtime Lakers would have beat the modern Warriors, or people going like, oh, the Lakers that only lost one playoff game, they would have beaten the modern Warriors. And I'm here to burst that bubble and say, if you go back in time, if you take any modern NBA team and take them back in time, they wipe the floor with a historical team.
Just on 3-point shooting alone, I'd say.
As long as we get enough distance, even if they have to adapt to old person's rules, right? James Harden is so damned good at threes that in the 90s, when they're not even used to defending that many threes a game, he would just rain hell. So and I call that the Back to the Future test. And the example I'll give you is in Back to the Future, very beginning of the movie, Marty McFly, he's supposed to be a nerd, right? And he's bullied and all this, and his band really sucks and all that. And he goes back in time, and he's the greatest skateboarder, because they haven't invented skateboarding when he goes back in time. He's the greatest skateboarder. He's an amazing musician, right? He's able to beat the bad guy because of his knowledge of the future. And that's just how the world works, right? We get better, we improve, we build on historical things. So that's time travel test number 3 I'd bring up. So as a reminder, Bill and Ted, compared to their own era, James Harden still beats Michael Jordan there. Time travel test number 2, clone high. That's if you were to take any great person, basically build them up as a clone from the ground up in the modern era, how would they compare to them past? Who knows? Basketball is one of the few places I still think it would work. Time travel test number 3, Back to the Future. If I take something from the future, time travel it to the past, how does it do? As a reminder, Back to the Future 2 too, Biff is from the future, and he actually travels back in time and wins, right? He's able to use modern knowledge of sports betting to make past him an amazing person. So that's Back to the Future 2. Now, of course, the heroes end up winning, but I would still argue Back to the Future 2 argues people from the future beat people from the past unless people from the past get insanely lucky. Back to the Future, the Time Travel Test 4, which is really kind of a comparison to that one. The Back to the Future is what I'd call hot tub time machine, which is if you transfer the knowledge of the future to the past, because that's what happens in that movie, in Time Travel and Hot Tub Time Machine. These people have lived their entire lives. They're in modern day. They're transported back in time, but it's just their consciousness is transported back into younger them. And then, of course, younger them are able to kick ass because they have knowledge from the future. How would that do? And I say the same thing, right? If you transported James Harden's knowledge back in time, he would still kick ass.
Yeah, I have not much to say about that. That's very, very conclusive.
Yeah, so it's funny. Like I said, it was a tepid take from Daryl Morey because I went for the only test I thought he had a take on, which was Michael Jordan compared to his contemporaries as compared to James Harden compared to his contemporaries. And all I can say is James Harden is amazing. Now, you obnoxiously immediately were like, well, I don't know if James Harden is the best. There are a lot of great bigs. And I have to keep digging, Brian, because you suggested some good names. You suggested like David Robinson. Wilt Chamberlain's going to be a little interesting because we don't have possession. We can't use the box score to make per possession data in that time, which is a little harder. But basically, in the modern NBA, I'd say the three-point era NBA, the greatest score that I could find by looking through the data, I already told you, is Kevin Durant. Kevin Durant is a freaking beast. Now, the one out James Harden might have to him is position, right? Kevin Durant is a small forward, power forward. You could maybe even argue center on those Warriors teams. James Harden is a shooting guard. Guards traditionally do not score as well. But if we then go by like a Greg Steele argument of being the primary offensive weapon, in which both James Harden and Kevin Durant would be that, Kevin Durant has been an absolute beast of a scorer in the NBA. Even Steph Curry doesn't touch James Harden when we're factoring in per possession, that stuff. And part of that also is health, right? Like Steph Curry's had some amazing seasons, just like James Harden, but Steph Curry has just not been as consistently great as James Harden or Kevin Durant have been.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And that first championship season, I think it was, he had the historic season where he was over, 0.4 wins per 48 for quite some time. And I think he finished at like 0.38 or 0.39. One of the best seasons of all time. But then he's had injuries and not, always been as good since. But that's just kind of Steph Curry all-time great levels. We'll have to see how it goes. Yeah, the Harden stuff is interesting because we talk about this a lot, right? But his shot selection is the best, but he takes so many contested shots. And that's, I think, where he should, look to improve even more. It's like the Michael Jordan angle. Well, you're already the best scorer in the league. Should you learn how to shoot threes to get even better at it? Well, that'd be the next step for Harden, I think, to get even better. Take a few less contested shots.
I will say the following, and this is also another fundamental, maybe philosophical disagreement, because I'm not saying it's wrong to use the contested field goal data as it is in the modern stats VU data, but it is hard to assess what is contested, what is not. I've argued this forever about Steph Curry, which is he doesn't look right. He always takes the same shot. And there is something that might look contested to me where if I ask Steph Curry, he's just like, oh yeah, he wasn't going to reach me in time. I knew I was going to get my shot off, because Steph Curry has such a consistent and such a fast release that it's almost, it is game changing in what he's able to do. So when we talk like James Harden taking the best shot, who knows on that? Although I am inclined to say the following: no matter how great a player in any sport, there is usually room for improvement in their game. And it is often, this is what we were talking about like earlier with Michael Jordan, about we're not even sure if he was trained modernly, if he would train the right way, because it is hard to break people of habits. Because I think, like, for instance, basketball is also in many ways, a competition amongst individuals, right? We see this all the time. Damian Lillard scores a three. Steph Curry comes up, takes a 30-foot three right back to be like, what, right? And you might say, look, that's not the smartest decision. That wasn't the best shot we could have got. What if we, it's the don't swing at the first pitch in baseball, right? Why don't we look for a better pitch versus the I'm going to take this first pitch to show I'm the man, right? That kind of mentality. So most players in basketball, I think, could improve their game. And it gets very hard for, and we'll bring this up more when we talk Greg Steele's article on the draft. It often gets into problems with behavioral psychology and economics, where you're basically asking people to make decisions that aren't ruled by emotion, whereas even the smartest people do that. I want to use this as tangent number 1 billion, Brian. We're just going kind of a all over the place show on fun topics we like this week. You gave Krishna Narsu, one of our favorites, follow on Twitter if you don't. You pointed out an amazing part, which is can you actually read it, because it was comparing Spider-Man breaking with the MCU, because don't forget Disney owns.
Oh yeah. Well, I just picked his out of all of them. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
It was amazing. So I'll explain the situation. You read the tweet, and I feel bad that I cut you off there because it's your subject, Brian. I don't feel that bad though. But basically, Marvel is owned by Disney, and Spider-Man is owned by Sony, because there was a lot of weird stuff with Marvel Comics back in the day, and they basically sold off the movie rights to Spider-Man in the 90s. And then Sony, of course, did the Sam Raimi, Tobey Maguire Spider-Mans that, took off. Same with the X-Men. So there's now this problem where Disney might not have access to Spider-Man, even though there's recently, with a Tom Holland version of Spider-Man, been a Spider-Man in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And you brought up a Krishna Narsu point that compared it to Kevin Durant's split with the Warriors.
Yeah, although funnily, it's not the Warriors fans' general opinion. No, so my overall point is just funny. NBA Twitter always, has answers for everything, including Sony and MCU. So that's why I love NBA Twitter. But yeah, what he says specifically, Sony is KD not liking the fact that Feige, Steph, is getting all the credit love for the fans, when in fact he is largely responsible.
Okay, so, and to fill people in even more, to get even more down the geek train, I believe it's Feige. I think that's how it's pronounced.
Oh, is it? I'm sorry. I'm not a big Marvel guy.
Is the person at Marvel that has been responsible for a lot of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and, this weird, the Avengers, all that stuff going on.
Big shot producer for...
Yeah, and everybody is giving credit for putting that together. Funny note is, back in the day, Kevin Smith was actually offered a similar job right before basically the first comic bubble burst. So Kevin Smith has basically said, one, he would not have been as successful as Kevin Feige, because Kevin Feige is amazing. I hope I'm getting the name right. And second, he was basically like, and also we were going to lock up shop. The doors were going to shut on me afterwards. So it's, he's kind of saying that was supposed to be my job, but first that job was going to be gone. For those that don't remember, comic book movies started failing, especially when we got like the Arnold Schwarzenegger Batmans and stuff. And that actually killed. So Tim Burton was supposed to do a remake of Superman with Nicolas Cage. There's a ton of footage. There's a great documentary on it. And they basically, after the failure of the Joel Schumacher Batman, were like, we're done. We're out. We're stopping with superhero movies. They're stupid. And so that's what Kevin Smith says. But anyway, Kevin Feige, big shot producer at Marvel that put together the Marvel Cinematic Universe. This is the Avengers. This is Captain America, all that stuff. And what they're saying is Sony is going, hey, Spider-Man is awesome. It's not, we don't need you. He's awesome on his own. And there might be an argument to that. And I love that point. And when I was bringing up all the behavioral stuff, that's the point about like Kevin Durant and other great players, is where you go, if you want to be the most efficient scorer of all time, if you want to win the most titles of all time, here's what you should do. Whereas at the same time, we've heard all sorts of weird rumblings. And I really want to read it. Jeremy Britton recommended not an autobiography. That'd be even crazier. A biography about Kevin Durant. It's an unauthorized biography about Kevin Durant that was examining him, and just all of the weird mentality stuff with Kevin Durant that gets very interesting. Kevin Durant and Michael Jordan, two of the greatest scorers ever. It gets baffling and confounding, and also just so interesting when you look at their motivations and how they viewed things and all of that stuff. Because, I've mentioned Michael Jordan is the most beloved basketball player, most impactful. I'm going to say no player in almost any sport. I think that's right. I think maybe Michael Jordan's, Tiger Woods, and maybe Serena Williams. I'm trying to think in U.S. sports, because I think maybe Pele in soccer, the most impactful person in their sport. We're just have the.
Yeah, if you're saying like economically, so the NFL blew up kind of at the same time, but I don't know if you could say there was one NFL player like there was with Jordan.
I think Michael Jordan. Yeah, like I said, Michael Jordan. The names I'm giving you, Michael Jordan.
Joe Montana, maybe.
No, I can't. I mean, NFL's never.
That's the only one I can think of for NFL.
Yeah, but most impactful player in North American sports, and I'm putting him on that pedestal. So I'm saying like he gets the gold medal on a pedestal with people like Tiger Woods and Serena Williams as well, of being just like most impactful outside of the sport, all that stuff. And his Hall of Fame speech was like a hatchet job of people that he felt had wronged him. And you're like, What are you doing? And then Kevin Durant, right? 2-time finals MVP, multiple scoring champion person, right? Guaranteed first ballot Hall of Fame. And this is a guy that made like burner accounts to argue with people with like 30 followers about why he was great. So the mentality of these people is amazing. And the reason I love that point is it's like, yeah, a lot of times these weird decisions that happen in all walks of life, basketball, movies, all this, aren't as driven by smart analytics nerds, despite the fact that that's what everybody wants you to believe. It's driven a lot by like pettiness and weird mentalities.
Okay, so looking at this again, I think I got it backwards, Krishan Narsi's point. He's saying Sony and KD are the ones that are a little delusional. Really, it's Feige/Steph, if I'm probably pronouncing it wrong again, that rightfully deserve the credit, I think is what he's saying.
Well, I think a good metaphor there is you could probably argue, if you're factoring in Sam Raimi's completely forgetting the Tom Garfield and going, so if you do Sam Raimi's first 2 movies, exclude the third one, if you do the Tom Holland Spider-Man movies, the first 2, and then how he did in Civil War and Avengers, and then do Into the Spider-Verse, Spider-Man, I think I'm going to say this comfortably, Brian, Spider-Man has probably made the greatest collection of superhero movies for that individual superhero. I think that's right.
Over what era? MCU or all time?
That's what I'm saying. I'm saying if you go over all of the superhero movies across all time, this is including like Christopher Reeve Superman as well, the Spider-Man character and Spider-Man under Sony too. Spider-Man under Sony has produced the greatest collection of individual superhero movies. I think that's fair to say.
Interesting. Well, those are, some Sam Raimi, all those guys involved, the new people doing Spider-Man now, those are some really good people.
Yeah. Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse is amazing. Whereas you argue that the Warriors and then, of course, Kevin Feige, a system, like a collection of doing great things, the light years ahead, it may be the death. I'll reserve. Let's wait till the end of next season, Ryan, sorry.
I'm definitely waiting.
But if they don't win 50-plus games next season, I'm declaring the death of light years. So that's what they have to cross.
So I'm declaring the death of light years anyway, because to me, light years is not an era of the Warriors. It's like what the process of the front office, basically. They're saying our front office's process is light years ahead. I think we've seen that process unfold for long enough that that's totally bogus. Now, they could get results despite a bad process, though, just because they do have Steph Curry still and a few other good players.
It will 100% wind down to how D'Angelo Russell does, or what they do with D'Angelo Russell. Because for those that don't remember, the 2 big moves that the Warriors made, they extended Klay Thompson to a max contract worth over $30 million a season, and they signed and traded Kevin Durant, because Kevin Durant
and Andre Iguodala.
So they signed and traded Kevin Durant to get D'Angelo Russell from the Brooklyn Nets, and they salary cap dumped Andre Iguodala is what happened there. So all of that. So if they do something intelligent with D'Angelo Russell and Steve Kerr turns Klay Thompson into an amazing player with Kevin Durant gone, I'll eat crow, but I'm not betting on it. Like there is no betting slip you can hand in front of me where I would bet on me believing the process is wrong. As an example, the Spurs, right, with both with LaMarcus Aldridge, not DeMarcus, right, with LaMarcus Aldridge and not D'Angelo Russell, too many wrong names, with LaMarcus Aldridge and DeMar DeRozan. With both of those players, they improved underneath Popovich, and they improved to be decent players that are almost worth the money. Not worth the money in that market for what it's worth, but almost worth the money. I'm like, yeah, good job. But then, of course, our take, you and me would always say, if you could do that with expensive, mediocre NBA players, why don't you do that with inexpensive, underrated stars?
Yeah. Yeah, no, they've just like buried themselves in all these contracts, and they don't have much flexibility anymore, and they just don't have a lot of money to spend on front court players. So, yeah, they're in the position now where instead of having an embarrassment of, riches on their roster, they're going to have to get lucky a little bit. They don't have a lot of size that's necessarily that healthy.
While we're on the Warriors, I'll finish our last topic and then finish up with Greg Steele's draft article, and then I think we can be good for shout-outs. So just a weird bit of news that's kind of a shame. I want to preface all of our analysis with a point first, which is we're going to talk to DeMarcus Cousins, and I want to preface with I'm never a fan of injury. I never consider injury proof of anything, no matter how hard I rally against any player in the NBA being overpaid, overrated, etc. They're still humans, and I don't ever wish them ill will. I think it is important sometimes to take a holistic step back and go, I'm arguing about how well you put a ball through a hoop. One of the players I bashed most and have actually took a step back on a lot last season was Donovan Mitchell. And like one of the rough parts about Donovan Mitchell, we talk Spider-Man, right? Donovan Mitchell loves Spider-Man, and he's been in all sorts of funny Spider-Man
commercials. His nickname's the Spider.
The nickname's the Spider. There's a great Tom Holland commercial with Donovan Mitchell in the Spider-Man costume. There's all sort, he does good off the court stuff. He's got a good sense of humor. You've said the same thing about Joel Embiid. Joel Embiid is amazing on Twitter. So no matter how much I'm analyzing about how good or bad you are at putting a ball through a hoop, getting a ball, when I take a step back and you're human, I want that clear that I never wish ill will on the human. I feel a lot of times people cross the line on sports in that regard. It's like, I am so mad that you beat my team. I am mad too. And they're like, I'm going to break your legs. You're like, no, what are you doing? No, these are humans and we never wish ill will. And it absolutely sucks. Obviously, I believe I always get ACL. I looked it up. So it's ACL and Achilles, right? And yes. So obviously ACL.
Where our confusion was Klay Thompson, Kevin Durant. One of them had an Achilles injury and one of them had an ACL in the same game. We were on with Chris Ye and a little confused about it.
And so I believe Chris Ye was Achilles, and I think DeMarcus Cousins is ACL.
So DeMarcus Cousins tore his Achilles a few years ago, but now he just tore his ACL recently.
ACL, and so he's going to be out for the season. And ACL is knee, and Achilles is ankle, basically.
It's the heel. It's the Achilles tendon. Think about the movie, right? In the Trojan War, they shoot him in the heel. Yeah.
Okay. But DeMarcus Cousins just basically suffered a season-ending injury. And what's key is, first off, any player coming back from an ACL or Achilles, either of those injuries is horrible. Most players never come back from. Actually, I'm trying to think. Have any players come back from like an Achilles legit? Because I think Chris Ye was saying that, like when Kobe Bryant ruptured his Achilles, he's like, his career is over, and that was the case. And I think some players do come back from ACL. I can't remember if that was Amari Stoudemire, but Amari Stoudemire did come back and play not his normal self, but did play decently. So I don't know, but basically the fact that DeMarcus Cousins has now had Achilles and ACL, his career is likely done, at least in the sense of him ever being a productive player, and that really, really sucks.
Yeah, you're right. Players do. So ACL is really, really bad, but players do come back from that quite a bit. Achilles is a lot less common. I'm trying to think of some players like last year on the Warriors, Jonas Jerebko was one of those players. So he was talking to Cousins about the rehab, for instance, was a story. And he played pretty well for the Warriors last year. So, yeah, there have been some players, but it's not like Tommy John elbow surgery where you can be as good or better afterwards, right? I think Achilles are pretty bad.
And yeah, an ACL is not much. I mean, and it's, DeMarcus Cousins it's hard to say, right? We have not seen him consistently on the court since that Achilles injury. And that brings me into topic number one. And that's why I wanted that precursor to say that really sucks DeMarcus Cousins. I also really feel for the fact that DeMarcus Cousins essentially lost a max contract, right? Between all of his injuries. If DeMarcus Cousins had been on the market one season earlier than he was, he gets a max contract. Him and Isaiah Thomas probably lost each $20+ million a season because they went on the free market 1 year after they would have wanted to, I would say. And so that really sucks. But Cousins got injured, and a lot of people are like death of the Lakers, and it is so reminiscent to me of last year with the Warriors, which is so many people were putting all of their eggs into, oh my goodness, DeMarcus Cousins is really going to transform this team. And me going, he's an interesting, in both cases, in both the Lakers and the Warriors case, I was like, he is an interesting signing with upside at the right price. That's the funny thing. That's what makes me laugh the most about DeMarcus Cousins, Brian, because he was one of our early haterade targets, right? We've gotten a lot of fame for hating Carmelo Anthony, Kobe Bryant, DeMarcus Cousins, now Donovan Mitchell. DeMarcus Cousins, I called him not an all-star right before he was named to the all-star team and got a lot of traffic for that. Last couple, we thought he was horrible. We thought the Kings handled his contract situation. His drafting was good, his contract situation horribly. every contract he's been signed to since, I've agreed with. When he was traded to the Pelicans, I was like, great trade by the Pelicans. If he works out, there's upside. If he doesn't, you can let him go because it's a short-term deal. When he signed with the Warriors, I was like, great deal. It's a minimal, it's a mid-level exception, 1-year deal. If he works out, great. If he doesn't, you let him walk. And the same with the Lakers, right? I'm like, he's a cheap deal. If he works out, great. If he doesn't, you can let him walk. So it is amusing to be this player that I've been called overrated and overpaid for the first half of his career to be like, yeah, I agree. But it's still been bizarre to me to see people to expect him to have an impact when you get an injured player that's dealing with recurring injuries. You should really view them as if they work out, it's great. But if they don't, we should plan around it. And to be fair, the Lakers did keep JaVale McGee. So to at least that point, they at least have a center. They might need one more because JaVale McGee is old as well. But it was bizarre to me to see multiple seasons of people thinking DeMarcus Cousins coming off a major injury was going to make a huge impact, as opposed to saying, let's wait and see on that.
Yeah, and for a lot of people, like you have to update your priors, when you're thinking about players. Like I remember one of the times Chris Ye came on the show and I said something like, yeah, Joe Ingles is just kind of okay. And he's like, you haven't looked at his numbers lately, have you? And he was right. I hadn't. Joe Ingles had been really good. I just hadn't looked at his numbers lately. So I think that's what's going on with Cousins. Like people remember, some of the talent he had in the past, but you got to look at what his body's work has been. Unfortunately for him, it's been because of injury. Yeah,
sports is very much a what have you done for me lately league, which is absolutely rough. But that's also, I bring up not a time travel movie, one of my favorite in the sense of like so bad it's good movies. And I forget what it's called. It's called like Manager of the Year or something. It's about a young kid that inherits the Minnesota Twins from his grandfather.
Oh, that's right.
And he runs it as the manager. And he's got one of his favorite players plays on the team. And he's basically getting excited because this guy's got a ground ball hit, even though this guy's supposed to be, a leadoff hitter or a cleanup hitter. I forget what in the movie. And, it's basically he's told by the other manager on the team, he's like, it doesn't matter that he used to be great. You have to look at what he is now. And I'm trying to look up the title subtly in the background. So anyway, sports is very much the same way, where when you're looking at players, you have to look at their current body of work or what you expect them to do when you factor in things like age and injury, and not expect, you don't expect the best. That's I find a problem with so many of these preseason projections, which we have not participated in. Greg might have someplace that we'll point you to for sure. I know Arturo just did his with Danny LaRue over at Real GM, so you can go check those out. But I find so many of these projections there is not an effective way to say shit's going to happen this season and it's going to turn things upside down and we just don't know where.
Well, I know one of the things that you are always happy that Arturo does in his projections is that he lays out what his assumptions are, in that I think the coach is going to give these players this many minutes, right? So he's trying to calculate that in some way. Now, I think your overall point is right. That's very difficult to do. But most people don't even attempt to do that when they're making their projections.
When you're projecting an NBA season, you are both trying to read the mind of a coach, which is so freaking impossible. There's so many, one of my regular articles used to be bashing coaches going, what the hell are you doing? And a lot of people do that.
The coach is wrong? Was that the name of the article?
That was Arturo. Okay. Which is wrong. And what he actually did is he was analyzing coach effectiveness by going, here's how good your players are. Right. Here's on the court and who's good and who's bad at it, which is hilarious. So there's that. The most fun to do is in football, right, where we have people like Brian Burke of Advanced NFL Stats who's like, yes, the numbers say that, doing that play in that position is a horrible idea.
Fourth downs is the big one, right, in football.
The most simplified one that we know of at this point is if you are in fourth down, it is almost always the right mode to go for it. Basically, if you're like less than 7 yards and more than your own 40.
Yep.
Like it's almost always the right case to do that. You usually don't want to go for a free, in so many words wrong today, Brian, a field goal.
We're in basketball mode, aren't we?
Yeah. And the numbers say this easily. And so that's the problem is with NBA coaches are the same way. You're like, if they play smart, we're good. And then they don't, right? And then additionally, you kind of have to project injury. And the problem is those two factors alone, barring all else, what the coach is going to do and injury can impact things so much, because there's so many times where a player gets injured and that that reverberates through the rest of the team in weird ways, right? A player plays out of position, and so now they're, a player that we thought, oh my goodness, this player is an awesome player. Otto Porter Jr. is one that comes to mind, by the way, on the Wizards, where we're like, he's an amazing player. We're like, I looked and his numbers were going down. It's like, oh yeah, these injuries to players like John Wall, whatever, other players are getting shifted smaller. Otto Porter's getting shifted bigger, and Otto Porter's doing worse. And as a result, the team overall is hurting. And, the reason is John Wall getting injured is a big freaking deal. So that kind of stuff. So
he also made that top 5 passing list, by the way.
Oh, John Wall?
Yeah.
But he's same boat as DeMarcus Cousins. We have no freaking clue what's going to happen. Last capper on the DeMarcus Cousins point, Brian. I just want this as a gift. I just want it, Brian. So please give it to me, world. The rumor coming up, and I will never bet on this, right? Rumor coming up is because the Lakers are in need of a big, how about Dwight Howard?
Yeah, that's a rumor. There's a few others, though, like Gortat might be a little better. So we'll have to see.
It's interesting. But I
actually like Joakim Noah. He's being considered as well. No, he can't score at all, but he still can rebound. So,
I just want Dwight on the team, Brian. I just want it.
Just for the Schadenfreude?
I just want it. It's very wrestling, right? There is watching sports to want to watch a winning team, and there's watching teams to want to watch drama. I don't know if this gives you both, but it certainly gives you drama. And I just want to see that, Brian. I just want to see Dwight Howard and the Lakers. I'm sure Lakers fans don't. I'm sure the Lakers front office doesn't. I want to see it.
I want to see it too.
All right. All right. Well, anyway, let's go to the last point. I don't have a subtle way to dig into this, but Greg Steele, like I said, doing a behemoth. If you're missing off-season content because Dre keeps traveling in the off-season of the NBA, that's why there hasn't been as much content on Nerd Numbers or Boxscore Geeks over the last couple months. Greg Steele over at Off the Glass Basketball, so it's otgbasketball.com, wrote another one where he called the solution for trade demands, because he's obviously talking about the essential problem we have in the NBA right now is as follows. We have the draft. We hate the draft, but Greg actually argues it's not going anywhere, and I have to grit my teeth and actually agree with his take in this article. So the NBA draft decides where players go. Additionally, the draft comes with restricted free agency, which means players are forced to resign with the team that drafted them unless they want to leave money on the table. In essence, a player's prime is committed to the team that drafts them, and that leads to things like Anthony Davis demanding a trade where he is frustrated with the team that drafted him and wants out. Now, the solution Greg proposes is as follows. Oh, and actually, I want to give some credit to what he said, because like he said, the draft's not going anywhere. And his argument is very much political, and I like this, Brian, which is to say there are a lot of high-minded people, we might fall in that category ourselves a lot, Brian, that go, this is wrong. Here is how the world should be. And then there are pragmatists that say, look I understand that if you were given your druthers to make a basketball league from scratch, the draft would have no part of it. But if we are going to change the NBA, we have to understand that there is an existing system in place and existing people that benefit from said system. And any change that we do has to satisfy those people. The comparison we were making ahead of time pre-show, Brian, was the Constitution. We're both history buffs. I'm starting to read more history stuff. And when you look into the Constitution, this document that people are like, this is the word of God that the founding fathers all came together and God on high handed it to them, and that's how we go. So much of that document is compromises, people sacrificing their own ideals for things that they thought were more important. You mentioned things intentionally left vague so that there might be room for interpretation later. That is how the real world works. The real world is a lot of idealistic people, proud people, unscrupulous people working together, forcing compromises to get things done. And if you were going to change the NBA, you have to exist in that system. And the reason Greg says the draft isn't going anywhere is, one, the draft leaving is bad for owners because the draft is an amazing wage suppression tool for owners. Even leaving outside, tanking, getting new talent, because rookie salaries are capped, it is an amazing tool for owners. Additionally, this was a point that I don't see brought up a lot, ourselves included, Brian. He said, if you got rid of the draft and just did a free agent market for upcoming rookie classes, it would be bad for existing NBA players because now because the NBA is a salary capped league. That means every team is allowed to spend against how much the league earns, and that's capped every year. If all of a sudden all these young players are getting offered better money, that money comes from somewhere and it comes from the veterans. And the NBA we know is a star-driven league. You're never able to pay in a capped league LeBron James, Michael Jordan, James Harden what they're worth. And so for a majority of players in the NBA, if you suddenly took money out of the pot, they're just going to get paid less. This is the veterans. So the veterans of the NBA and the owners of the NBA and the general managers, none of them would want to give up the draft. And so as much as people like us might say, get rid of the draft, make it a free market system, that none of the players that vote on such things, the players in the Players Association, the general managers who are going to argue to, the commissioner, none of these people will ever agree with it. But he does make a possible compromise that I think basically it works between the players and the owners. And so what he says is, first off, let's keep the existing draft pay scale in place, right? I draft Brian number 1 in the NBA draft. I get him at a reduced value for the first 2 years, a slightly reduced value for years 3 and 4. The old system says I get Brian Foster's restricted free agent right from years 5, probably for a 5-year deal, because that's you're allowed to offer a max salary to like a number 1 pick would probably get a max salary. So basically, I get Brian for 9 years, 4 years at a reduced cost, and the right to get him from years 5 to 9 with the second one. He says, we leave that in place, but we remove restricted free agency. He says, you can get Brian for 4 years at a reduced cost, but at the end of those 4 years, he's unrestricted. So either you have to convince him to stay or he's allowed to leave. That's Greg's first argument. That's option A, behind door number 1. Behind door number 2 is you are allowed to get their restricted free agency, but you have to offer them a deal at least twice as good as the number 1 pick on the old system. And so now you get into a fun system where you draft a Zion Williamson and you say, I want your rights, so I'm going to pay up for it. So this is a very fun system where marquee players can get paid more, and then there also becomes compromise between the two, where one of the weird things now about how the NBA draft works is there's really no bargaining between a player drafted and the team that gets them, right? You draft Zion Williamson, and his options are, I play for you, I don't play, I don't get paid. Now he might say, hey, look, I don't want to play for you. So you offer me that 1, you get that, you build a team around me, we go from there. Or he goes, I want the money, I want to get paid, you offer me 2. And I really love this from like a behavioral economist standpoint. And I think the classic problem is the owners traditionally in the NBA are just too damn good at bargaining. So I don't think they ever give into this, but I don't hate it. I think a well-run, and we do think Michelle Roberts is pretty good, I think a well-run Players Association working right could argue for something like this, and I do think it's an improvement.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to look at it. It is very realistic, it is very consensus building, and it's not the perfect plan that we would pick. But, it's a proposal for a consensus, and I like that. And, I guess he's saying the owners would like it because they can kind of lock the players in for longer, but then the players also get leverage. It's really interesting.
It's basically what he's putting on the table is saying, I'm going to get rid of stars demanding trades, but the way I do that is either 1, you agree to get them discounted for the first 4 years, or you agreed to get their restricted free agency. You don't get both. Right. So basically, the major change he's doing is he's saying old methodology says you get them drafted at a discount and their restricted free agency. New methodology says you pick 1. And I think obviously what the players are going to argue, and this is the leverage they're holding, is players like Jimmy Butler or Anthony Davis who start demanding trades, saying they're going to have to stop demanding trades. They've made their agreement. But that is what goes up. And I think that's not a horrible start. And I think it's actually, what's funny is I think a well-run Players Association could get that through, because I think it's very hard. We've talked this before in the past, where it's the NBA Players Association for so many years, basically post-Jordan, has sucked at negotiating. And it's very much the same as like Democrats versus Republicans, where the Democrats have given up so much over the years that now we consider a progressive or radical candidate to be one that's trying to argue for status quo in the 60s or 70s, which is hilarious. And it's the same with the NBA, right? The NBA has to fight to get back to norm. And I think this is a sufficient enough first step for the players that is good, while also going, man, it really sucks, because if you look at where the players were right after Jordan retired, they were in a much better spot than this.
Well, so I think it would help in a lot of cases. Let's get back to where all this came from, right? It's basically people are arguing in the NBA media world whether Anthony Davis was right or wrong to force his way off the Pelicans, right? That's where this came from. So Greg's assumption here is that basically restricted free agency is the cause of all this, right? That players can't decide where they're going to play soon enough. And I think he's right in some cases, but I think just because they get more freedom earlier, it's not going to solve all of these. Like, a lot of it's just personalities, right? Like, maybe some coach gets hired that the player doesn't like. Like, this wouldn't solve that, right? Because, they signed the deal under the other coach. So I don't know. I think it might reduce it a little, but I don't know if it'll totally solve it.
I'll put it this way, is I'll compare it to the NCAA with players getting paid, where so many people are like, just pay the players. And I think that would be the right world. But I think it's also at the same time going, there's this huge exploitative system, including the NBA, in place where it's hard to do that. So what you have started seeing is random coaches offering things, because coaches are like, I'm paid millions of dollars a year. If this system goes away, I lose my money. I'll give them something. And then, of course, smart people going, oh, what that coach is offering is bullshit, right? If you offer them a stipend, that's not what they're worth. You need to offer more. And so I think the same thing is happening here, where people are starting to question, especially with Kawhi, Anthony Davis. I'd argue maybe a little Paul George, but he I think he just did it better. And maybe Indiana's not big enough of a market, and he was injured, so he wasn't as big of a name. But essentially, Kawhi and Anthony Davis arguing their ways off the team spooked people. And so we're like, right world is free market. If owners want to overpay, they're billionaires, they overpay, let them deal with it. That's one. But we're probably not going to get there. So the question is this a compromise? And I think it's what I would call a sufficient enough step forward for the players while also compromising that I'm happy with it as a starting point.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I think our frame of reference to this is always the business world, right? And so one of the things we always say is it's surprising that an NBA player is paid, like a C-level executive at a big Fortune 500 company, right? And they get all these background checks and personality profiles and all that, and they should do it. They should treat, NBA players more like that. And yeah, I mean, it's like, I don't know. I lost my train of thought here, but yeah.
Well, I think what we come into, and we've said this before, is it can get very weird looking at systems from the outside in. Exactly what I was saying about DeMarcus Cousins, right? We spend so much time arguing about how good this player is at putting a ball through the hoop that sometimes we lose sight of, well, they're a human. Yeah. And I think the same thing is true, is like the NBA as a normal business system is not normal. So it gets very funny when you're trying to do deals, because you have to like exist in that world and kind of exist outside of it. And I think you and I will always have a problem with the fact that the system in place for the NBA as a business, getting publicly financed stadiums in bad markets, all of these billionaire owners getting all of these rights, and then all of these players getting treated weird despite being in a union, all that stuff. It's just never going to sit right with us. So I'm doing I like I said, I'm doing the I think Greg and I are both doing the pragmatist thing here, which is to say, inside of that system, could this work? And then me trying to also simultaneously kind of look at it on the outside and go, is that enough for me to think it's a positive move? So it's a weird world.
One thing I said about this article on the pre-show that I really liked, I don't think I said it on the show yet, is the nuance that he looks at kind of the different positions that are involved with this argument. So I think I do this sometimes too, which is kind of say, well, here's what the owners want, and here's what the players want. And he's really dividing the players up into different groups, and that the different players need different things, right? He's saying that going to this totally free market like the two of us would want would make it more winner take all for the players, because the players would get more correctly compensated. And yeah, it would end up more like the NCAA, right?
So actually, possibly even worse there, incorrectly compensated, because here's what's funny. I could see it being bad. So he argues it's bad.
Oh, I see, yeah.
He's arguing it's bad for veterans, because essentially you have a veteran that's a good player, and there's a young player that comes in. If they're paid more,
Zion, right?
But it gets funny too for stars like Giannis that break out late. Because if a star that breaks out late, if there are young players that are now getting all the money now that he's worth the money, there's less there for him. So I think Greg rightly analyzes that the veterans in the league, the two types of veterans I would qualify, late breakout stars and veterans that are maybe average or above players, they're going to get dinged in terms of pay because obviously, it's very much there's only one ball, right? As soon as you spend the money on a player in a salary cap league, that's money that's not going elsewhere. And he's going, which players is this going to hurt? And it's definitely going to hurt like players drafted 15th plus in the draft that were undervalued that suddenly become good and veterans that are, trying to stick around for a few more years.
Yeah, and just my last point on this is to agree with you kind of in the middle when you when you talked about, the veterans versus the youngest player. Basically, the way the system it is now, it screws over the rookies and young players in the biggest way possible, right? And that's because it's the veterans and the owners negotiating it. So, of course, that's the way the system is.
And the same thing, I don't recall exactly because I haven't looked at the NFL as well, but I recall the same thing happened. The last NFL, it was like a pseudo lockout, right? It didn't remove any games, didn't remove preseason, it removed very little of the offseason. But I believe I recall reading a little bit about that. Like usually in these agreements, the easiest group to screw over is rookies or rookie contracts because they're not at the table.
Because I know I said the last thing was my last, but this is really it. Remember what this style of rookie pay scale in the NBA was in response to, right? It was that era, I guess, in the early to mid 90s where you did have some players taking up huge portions of the cap, right? I think Kevin Garnett was one when he was on the Timberwolves. Now, he was a great player, so maybe he deserved it. But that was the league, and a lot of people didn't like that he was making so much of the salary. Of course, the
real player, the player.
Well, Rashard Lewis was the other one I was going to say. People really hated that deal because it was forever and ever, so many years. So. But anyway, what are some of your examples from that?
There's one player this traces back to, and it actually goes to Milwaukee. It was Glenn Robinson.
Yes, good point.
Got a rookie deal and asked for a 6-year. I forget at the time. I can look that up in just a sec. But it was a 6-year, and at the most time, the most a rookie had ever been paid. And right after that happened, right after Glenn Robinson got that deal, the next contract, they were like, F this, rookie contracts are fixed. We are not dealing with this. And the max contract thing, that was in direct response to Kevin Garnett, and I think Rashard Lewis would be in the same boat, which
Thank
is they
you
were
for the history lesson. Now we figured out why we're here.
Okay, actually it was 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. It was like a 9-year, $60 million contract for Glenn Robinson. So, and it's funny how the world changes, right? Because that's nothing now.
Yeah, wow. And that was what, 94, 95, something like that. So
wow.
Yeah.
You were on. It was exactly 94, 95.
Lucky
Brian,
guys.
I've gotten through all of my topics that I had on the script. If you have anything else, if not, I have a couple shout-outs.
No, go for the shout-outs.
Also, we lucked out right before the show. Brian mentioned that I don't know if I'm going to get it right, but it's Jirachi in Pokemon Go, that quest. And I was almost like, I'm going to leave and just do that instead of do the show or just talk the whole show about it. The only thing I'll shout out there is if you are looking to do the friend part of the Jirachi quest in Pokemon Go, if you are a Pokemon Go player, if you didn't know this hack, I'm surprised, but if you're friends with someone, if you unfriend and refriend yourselves, it counts you as +1. So the first part of the Jirachi quest in Pokemon Go, you have to get 3 new friends. You can just find someone you're already friends with, unfriend yourself, refriend yourself, unfriend yourself, refriend yourself, unfriend yourself, refriend yourself. That'll count for 3, or at least historically that would work. So I'm giving that advice out there. All right. The other shout out I want to give to, Brian, is to Daniel O'Brien and the book How to Fight Presidents. So I read this. We after a couple weeks of it in a row, we took a week off, but we were talking politics a lot for a couple shows. And I was like, promise, we won't talk politics at the top of the show. But I started reading How to Fight Presidents from Daniel O'Brien, finished it. It was on Audible. It was great. And to the exact point we made on a couple shows about how despite all of this stuff being like remarkably like almost baffling, we're like, oh my God, what is going on? Historically, there is so much weirdness and I think I can't believe I forgot the name already, Brian, because you and I talked it a little. But I mean, there was a case in U.S. history where very similar to Trump, the Republican Party put up a guy. It was a different Republican Party at the time than the one we have today. But the Republican Party put up a guy and they didn't expect him to win. And then they realized at the last second that if he won 4 states, those electoral votes would get him elected. So they spent the modern day equivalent of like $300,000, or actually I think back in the time, $300,000 in that time to go buy those states to to basically just send people in to convince voters to vote for the right candidate. And they managed to get a president that lost the popular vote, but won the electoral vote. And almost, did Russia interfere? Was there extra help? It was like very explicit. Like the party's like, oh yeah, we paid people to very clearly go intimidate, buy whatever voters into getting our guy in to get him in despite not winning the popular vote. So like that's U.S. history. And so if you're looking for like a fun read, I'd put it in the vein of like Drunk History. It's not 100% serious. He makes jokes. I listened to some of the Audible with my wife, and I had to explain that when he was talking about how George Washington didn't have wooden teeth, he had, I think he said iron testicles. I was like, he's obviously joking. That's a joke line. But it's a very fun read. So I would give that. It's a great Audible listen, or if you like reading old school ways, How to Fight Presidents from Daniel O'Brien. That's my shout out.
I have an update for you, Dre, as my shout out. Based on some brief reading, it looks like none of the things we were looking at were correct for Kevin F's pronunciation. I'm seeing it's Feige.
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 Okay.
Not
okay.
5G or Feige or Phage.
Okay, well, the good news is traditional box score geeks, we have to wait till the very end of the show when someone on YouTube or on the Box Score Geek show says, hey, that's not how you say the name. Or in the case of like Dirk Nowitzki, I go on for years doing it. So, Brian, good news. It only lasted about an hour of us getting. So say it one more time.
Oh, no, now I've got all mixed up again. I believe it is not Feige, but Feige.
Feige. And if we're wrong, Kevin, if you watch the show,
I'm sure he does. Yeah, I'm sure he does.
Well,
although apparently the reason why he was involved in this news story is because he was secretly working on extra movies. So yeah, he's probably too hardworking to listen to the show.
I believe he listens to us, and he took all of our notes to heart on the Marvel universe. Even though I still haven't watched Avengers Endgame, I've seen it on the Redbox. I don't think it's there yet, but I've seen it show up, and so I'm looking forward to watching it at some point.
My shout out is to Avengers Endgame. Go watch it.
I've heard it's a good movie. All right. Well, anyway, that's our show. If you've been us not through the website, you can find us at boxscoregeeks.com. We go live every Monday at 9:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, unless there's travel or other stuff going on. Just listen to the recaps. When we get more consistent live, we'll let you know. But anyway, if you want to catch recaps of the show, you can find them on Channel Nerd Numbers on YouTube. We also have the audio version, of course. You can find that on iTunes and Stitcher, the Box Score Geeks show. Subscribe, upload, helps us out. I haven't asked for like ratings. I probably should at some point that we could read them, but whatever, one of these days. Anyway, I've been your host, Ray Alvarez, aka Nerd Numbers. With me as always, Brian Foster, aka Box Score Brian on Twitter. That's been our show. Hope you have a good week, and we'll see you next time.